When it comes to choosing motherboard for your PC, honestly, I don't blame you if it's complicated because there are so many different numbers, sizes, names, letters that just makes it very confusing. Which one is for AMD? Which one is for Intel? What? I can't use that DDR5 in there. What the heck is Arden? What? I'm losing PCI slots? XMP is not available? I can't overclock? What on earth is going on? Because all of these things are for different motherboards. In this video, I'm gonna make it simple for you so you don't need another video to understand which motherboard you should be getting. After watching this, you'll be like, I know which motherboard to get. Let's get right to it. It's so annoying. I don't want to pay hundreds of dollars to just change my Windows wallpaper just because my Windows isn't licensed. Well, why don't you try Hookies? That's a ton cheaper. And if you use the code TN20, you get it even cheaper. What do you mean? How do I get it and how is it possible? Well, see this video here, or the one you're watching. Click in the link on the video description, add the Windows 11 CD product to the cart, proceed to checkout, add the code TN20 for the extra discount. So what, the Windows 11 Pro OEM key is just $23.22? Yeah. Choose the preferred payment option and complete the purchase. The key will be available on the purchased orders in a few moments. Copy the key and paste it into your Windows activation settings and you're all done. Oh, that was easy. Is that Ryan Gosling? No. Anyway, by the way, the same discount code also works website-wide, so go check out other products, maybe like Microsoft Office. One of the first things I want to talk about is actually motherboard size, because when we're talking about the sizes, there are actually different types of size. So I'm going to start from the smallest one. We have ITX, we have M-ATX, then we have ATX, and then we have EATX. And it can be very confusing because first, if you're looking at the smallest size here, ITX, which I actually have in here, and you can see that even the motherboard box looks small. As you can see, this motherboard size is a lot smaller than what you have over here, but essentially sometimes even the smaller one can be more powerful. But these are different basically sizes that you can get there. M-ATX size is small motherboard. It basically does is it chips off everything from roughly around bottom here, so you won't have as many PCI slots. It doesn't go as low, but it's still the same width from left to right. And then we have ITX, and that I would call is mini motherboard size, something like that for the smallest PC cases and smallest size. This over here is M-ATX, and usually M-ATX, ITX, and ATX, they're all the same size. So when we're talking about ATX, this is the size. When we're talking about ITX, this is the size. You don't need to worry about it. But there is one other abnormal size, which is EATX, and I would call that is large. So basically EATX means extended ATX, and anything that is wider than this ATX, meaning like goes anywhere from here, is called EATX. Sometimes they're a little bit wider, sometimes there's a lot wider, sometimes extremely wide. They almost look like a big square this way. So these are the 4 motherboard sizes. The size is sorted, we can move on. Next, I want to talk about the letters of the motherboard, because within the motherboard name, there are different letters and they mean different things, or they give you certain kind of features, specs within the motherboard so you know which one to get. Before we do that, we really need to slot this now into 2. We're gonna have Intel and then AMD. And then within the Intel and AMD motherboards, we also need to slot it into 2, which is kind of a pro or workstation, and then we call it just consumer. And in order to make a difference between the pro or the consumer, or what you would call gaming or creator motherboards on the consumer side, there is just one letter difference, which usually the workstation motherboard starts with a W. Okay, whenever there's a W on Intel, it can be WZ90, for example. okay? But this W means workstation, okay? Whenever there's W in it, it's probably for a Xeon platform, something like that. That is not as common for most of the people out there. So just bear that in mind when you're looking for pro or workstation or consumer motherboards on Intel side. On the AMD side, it is actually called WRX, and then there's some kind of a number after that, either 80 or 90 or something like that. But that, again, I don't know what it means, workstation X or something like that. But now AMD and Intel, most of the motherboards sold are prosumer motherboard sizes, and we're talking about high-end, mid-tier, and then low-end motherboards. The high-end on Intel is called Z, and then on AMD it's called X. Now there might be different numbers attached to it next to it. Whenever you see X on AMD, it means high-end, and the same on Intel, high-end motherboard, where you have the most features, often overclocking, or the most M.2 slots, or the highest support is usually Z something. Then we've got B series on AMD and Intel, and then which both of them means mid-tier. And then there is a low tier, which can be different names on AMD A and on Intel H or something like that, and that can be low. Now, I don't want to focus on the low tier as much because these motherboards aren't as popular, and I don't think a lot of people should be, especially as a creator, you shouldn't be going with a low tier motherboard because you're going to start to lose a lot of the features that you really paid for your CPU to get, or you're not really getting the full performance of your system, if that makes sense. I want to focus on the mid and the high end on both sides of them. Now, once you know that, okay, I want to get the high tier motherboard or the mid tier motherboard, you have to figure out which series of the motherboard actually fits your CPU. Because with each CPU release, often, most of the time, you will also have a new motherboard series of a release. Meaning that you've got new motherboards with new CPUs. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that CPU can't be compatible with the previous generation, or vice versa, that the previous generation motherboard can't be compatible with the newer CPU. This is how it usually works. I'm going to start with Intel side, and then the latest right now that's available on Intel is Z890. Then we've got Z790, 690, 590, 490, 390, you get the point. It keeps going down, 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 and down. Then on AMD, the latest generation is X870, and there can be E in the end as well, but we're not going to put that in there. X670, X570, interestingly, the 7 series, and then it starts going down. AMD doesn't release motherboards as often, so they're a little bit different. In order to know how this lines up with different generation of CPUs, Z890 is Core Ultra 200 series. Because of the name change, is basically 15th gen, okay? Intel probably doesn't want me to say that, but it is 15th gen. Then Z790 is 13th and 14th gen. This was the first time where Intel released 3 CPUs in the same cycle. This was 12th gen, this was 11th, this was 10th, this was 9th. Some of these CPUs go together in the same kind of batch of upgrades. So usually on Intel, that's 2 series of motherboards, like these 2. Then we've got these 2, and then usually these 2. If you've got a 12th gen CPU here, then that can also be put into Z90 motherboard, or the 14th gen CPU can also be put on the Z690 motherboard, if that makes sense. So these within this region all are intercompatible, and the same with here and the same with here. But within that, you still have a little interesting weird quirks. For example, what happened here with the Z590, this here, is that for the first time 11th gen introduced PCIe Gen 4 SSD or NVMe storage, which was only available on the 11th gen, but not on the 10th gen. So if you wanted Gen 4 storage, you had to go with the latest generation or 11th. But also if you went with the 11th gen on the Z490 motherboards, you wouldn't really get it because the motherboard didn't support it. The CPU did, but because the motherboard didn't, you still didn't get it. So sometimes if you want the latest feature, you want to go with the latest kind of motherboard to match up the CPU. So hopefully whatever motherboard right now you're looking on Intel side, that would make sense for you. Now on AMD right now, this together here goes for Ryzen 7000 plus CPUs, because there was also a Ryzen 8000 somewhere in the middle here that doesn't have a motherboard release or anything. It's kind of a weird generation of CPUs. And then X870 was launched with Ryzen 9000 series CPUs. X570 was Ryzen 5000. So interestingly, that kind of started to make sense. You could have X370 and in there you'd have Ryzen 3000. Well, 2000 could be supported there as well, and even 1000. From Ryzen 1000 to Ryzen 5000, everything in here was supported. I can't remember if there was X270 motherboards as well, but X170, that was there as well. So you'd have lots of different CPUs in this kind of generation of motherboards. They were all Intel compatible. But as the new generation came out, new features came out like Gen 4 storage, Gen 5 storage. All Gen 5 came in here because there was a big gap in between there. There wasn't Gen 5 in this. But that's a little bit of a history how the different motherboards have gone up, and this is the high tier one. I often recommend you to go with the latest motherboard and the latest CPU if you can, because that allows you to be most future compatible. If anything gets launched in the future, most likely it will still be compatible and have the most features of the current motherboard chipset. But then there is also the B series on both sides of motherboards. And it's quite confusing because the B is mid-tier, and usually you would have a number here. I'm going to put it 0 right now, B0. And then on Intel side, you'd have 60. And then on AMD side, you would have 50. So if we're talking about actual motherboards, so then the latest one right now is B860. As you can see, I've got one here, B860. I will talk about that later. And then on AMD is B850, which is quite confusing. They look very, very similar. If you look at these, they're not compatible with each other whatsoever. So here I have B650, it's previous generation rather than the 860. They are not compatible at all. So now you have the B, and then this number in here, that middle number on both of them, that would go down, and that means different generation of motherboards. If you want to match the same B and then the Z, you want to make sure that this number in here would be the same number as this number in there, and then you'd know they're kind of the latest. So 8 is the latest generation. So this number in there basically means generation, and it's the same in there. And then this number in here would mean AMD, and this number in here would mean Intel. So if you see a motherboard in the future, hopefully they're going to keep it the same with 60 in there and then 50 on AMD, and that would mean exactly, you know, which one is for AMD, which one is for Intel. Usually they would also tell you this on the box. So if we're looking at this one, we've got the Threadripper socket in there, or if we got this 860 here, you can see it's all Intel badges on it. And if you've got this one here, you can see Ryzen, and it will tell you what this is there. When we're talking about the motherboards, it's also very important to talk about the socket, okay? So what does the socket mean? Often the socket helps you to understand which generation of different motherboards you are on, because the same socket supports CPUs in different motherboards. So for example, AMD's latest socket is called AM5. The previous one was 4, by the way. And then on the Intel, the latest one is called, a little bit more complicated, LGA 1851. That is the latest. The previous generation was called LGA 1700, which is a little bit confusing, but basically this is the latest generation right now. And for Intel, the latest one is this right over there. Just a fun fact, by the way, this number here means that the pin number inside the socket, and so does this one. There was 1700 pins in the socket. Right now it's 1851. Okay, so if you're looking at the motherboard, it will also tell you the socket that there is. So if you're looking at this over here, you can see LGA 1851. That means that the socket. It explains which socket this is. You know, okay, 1851, I can put the latest Core Ultra 200 series in there. If you're looking at this motherboard in here, it says socket AM5. You know that whichever CPU is compatible with this socket, you can put it in there. In the back here, it says AMD Ryzen series processors. Sometimes they tell you Ryzen 7000, but actually it's also 8000 and 9000 compatible because they can't tell you like the future sockets. I'm gonna go back for a second because I wanna say that in the Pro of AMD, there is actually another option, which is TRX, because on AMD, we have something called Threadripper. And then this means Threadripper. And as you can see here, I've got a TRX motherboard. Threadripper and Threadripper Pro, they are sometimes compatible. So Threadripper Pro can go with Threadripper platforms, but not vice versa. You can't put a Threadripper CPU on a Threadripper Pro because Threadripper Pro has more DDR-RAM slots and PCI lanes and blah, 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 blah. That's how it is. So even the Pro lineup on AMD, you have first, let me go back into here. You have WRX, which is the first higher tier of Pro, and then you've got the second tier, which is the Threadripper platform. Now, when we're talking about other letters, there are other things that we should talk about because they mean different things as well. And now, because they're on both sides, I'm gonna put them together because that means on both Intel and AMD platforms. So if you see a -I in the end of a motherboard, so let's say this is either Z790 or X870, and then you have a -I in the end, what that means is an ITX size motherboard. So this letter here means ITX. So we see that this motherboard here means we've got the chipset, which is either X or Z on the motherboard. So we know the height here of Intel motherboards, but the I means ITX. So as you can see, we've got B860 and that -I means ITX. So even if you don't see a picture, but you see -I, it usually means ITX. On AMD, we have something called dash, or sometimes it's not dash, but you have X870E or 670E. That E over there is basically a higher tier within the X870. So just think about it as extra, not extra long. So it's not E80X, it's a bit confusing. So it's extra chipset. Does that make sense? Probably not, but it just means extra. I've got this X870E Aorus Master in here. So then the E means that it's the higher tier of X870. So you can get an X870 that is high end, but then the E means extra high end basically, which means sometimes they offer you more chipset power. So meaning bandwidth or throughput through the other expansion slots on the motherboard. So you have either more M.2 slots or PCIe slots, other connectivity on the motherboard that just the E, the extra chipset, can handle on the motherboard. It is confusing, but it is only on AMD. It is not on Intel. Intel doesn't have E. Z980E motherboard is just not there. Now, when choosing the motherboard, I want to give you another tip here because it's kind of only relevant at this point in time, which is the DDR support. Why this is important is because some of Intel's Z790 or Z690 motherboards support DDR5 or DDR4, and they are not intercompatible. Sometimes you have a motherboard that gives you an option to have either DDR4 or DDR5. So I have a Z690 a Strix motherboard that is D4 on ASUS, and that D4 means DDR4. So make sure that if you're looking for your motherboard, that your DDR4 is either a DDR4 or DDR5, depending what you want, and then go with that RAM. Very important. Now let's do a little recap. You need to know whether you are on Intel or AMD, because knowing which CPU you will have, that will tell you which platform you're going to be on. Next off, once you've figured the platform, you want to figure out whether you are on high, mid, or low tier. Either AMD or Intel, this is exactly the same. Okay, I want to be with the high tier, I want to go with the Z or X. I want to be mid tier, B, or low tier. Then it gets a bit confusing. I'm not going to go there at the minute. And then you want to go back up there and figure out what size of the motherboard you want. If you've got a case that you like, it might only support mini ITX or ITX motherboards, or maybe MATX case, because the case naming is often the same as well. So you've got a small case, or you want an ATX, which is the normal size over here, or EATX. That will actually determine your case size. Very important, because I have had cases where you're not supposed to use one of the motherboards and you lose some of the case features, like either some of the cable management is not going to work just because my motherboard is too large. For example, once you see that build over there, you'll see it was large. Then once you know you're on the higher end and you know your CPU, very important that you know which generation of motherboards you're actually going to go for and which motherboard kind of supports that. I always recommend going with the highest tier, with the latest motherboard, because here's a little tip that often people don't tell you. You sometimes think that I'm going to save money by going with the previous generation, but sometimes they've stopped the production of the previous generation and the stock of the previous generation is not as plenty as the latest generation, meaning that the prices of the previous generation are a lot higher. This is right now what's happening with the 13th and 14th gen, even though lower, and you could, with MSRP kind of scale, get better bang for buck on the previous generation compared to the Core Ultra series. But because of the actual motherboard stock and CPU stock, the whole platform cost is going to be more expensive. So I highly recommend checking out the latest in the previous generation platform pricing, not just motherboard and CPU. See how much the whole platform is going to cost. You know, make sure that if you want to go ultra high end, you'll have your E in there for AMD, or if you're looking for ITX, you know what the I means. And there's one last thing that we want to talk about, which is the actual naming. Each motherboard has their own naming. Gigabyte has a lot of Aorus Master, a lot of Aorus, Eagle. This name after the actual letters and numbers doesn't really mean anything. They have created their own tiers of motherboard layers, basically, and there's so many different ones. Sometimes they interlap and one of them gives you more features than the other one, but highly recommend going onto their website, whether Gigabyte or Asus, MSI, ASRock, whichever motherboard brand you're after, and then looking at which different versions of X870E, for example, they provide for Aorus Master. Sometimes there are white or light versions of motherboards if you're doing a light build, or if there's some with screen on, some with other features on there that you might actually want. Worth checking out the naming, because very often you see X870E, but it doesn't tell you the full story. Sometimes you have Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi missing. Sometimes you have lots of M.2 storage, sometimes not. Sometimes just only a few DDR slots, sometimes 4. So make sure that you have what you want from that motherboard. That's why I often recommend going with the higher tier one, because it kind of has every feature that you really need in there already. Now, if you are a creator, I highly recommend checking out different creator motherboards from different manufacturers. Right now, there are only 2. One from Gigabyte, which is called the Aero line, and then one from Asus, which is called ProArt line. And when you go with a ProArt on Asus, you already get 3 months for free of Creative Cloud Adobe. So if you're already paying for this, this kind of makes the pricing of that creator motherboard a lot lower, and it has some of the cool features there, like often 10 gigabit Ethernet and some of the other things that you might need for a creator. And then on Gigabyte, you have Aero D, and then G, different options. D is the higher one, and then G is a little bit lower option of the Aero motherboard. Unfortunately, Gigabyte doesn't give you any software free or boosts when going with that one, but Asus does have that. So if you're a creator, go check them out. I'm going to leave the links in the description below. And if you're wondering which motherboard or deep dives of the motherboard, I've got lots of these available on my channel, so go check out the full reviews on the channel and in the description below if you'd like to either reach out, because I always get back to my messages within 24 hours. There's build guides, other bits in the description below. Go check it out. Thanks guys for watching. God bless and bye bye.